So during the NBA Finals, Adam Silver had a 1 hour presser with the media, and boy, was he asked some questions. Oh, he was on a tightrope just trying to do this balancing act of just kind of avoiding certain questions and just dancing around, doing this seance talk, just kind of getting to the point, but not really getting to the point, but kind of also at the same time giving the media the insight of what the league is thinking and how they're making adjustments, especially after this pandemic issue. Now, he was asked a question about the NBA's future relationship with China, and boy, oh boy, was the NBA PR department going apeshit. Jesus! 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 Let's see what he had to say.
Take the second part of your question first. Some number of years ago, we had discussions with the Chinese Basketball Association, which of course is now led by Yao Ming, about potentially partnering on a league. That's nothing we've talked about all that much in the last few years. I think the Chinese Basketball Association continues to thrive under Yao's direction. And that'd be my expectation, that they will remain independent of the NBA. In terms of the future of our relationship with China, meaning the NBA's, I mean, of course, it's hard to divorce what's happening with the NBA from larger geopolitical issues.
Exactly. Because the NBA is in business right now of just growing their league on a global stage. Because domestically, the league has not really grown since Jordan left it 2003. This is a tricky situation that the league is in. They're kind of in a gray area because the ideology of just the Chinese government and the US government will never ever be the same. So they have to sort of tread this middle ground and try to find some common ground through sports. That might be the marketing campaign to kind of, ease the US consumer into understanding why the NBA has a relationship with China.
Between the US and China, I do think it remains important that, particularly when tensions are high between governments, that we foster these sports, educational, cultural relationships. I've said that from the very beginning. It certainly doesn't mean that we are blessing everything that happens in China by any means. And we are at root an American company. And so we follow US government policy. But it's my expectation that we will continue to distribute our games in China through your service, Tencent, and others. And
that's a hell of a deal. That Tencent deal is a hell of a deal the NBA got. And the Houston Rockets are viewed as China's team. In China, of course. But that's very important because that revenue that's being generated off of that is insane. And best believe the NBA gets broadcasted in 250 different countries, over 50 different languages. So this global outreach, the NBA is heavily invested in it, as they have leagues throughout various continents, and they have a game plan on developing some of these leagues and some of this talent to cultivate it to get into the US market, aka the NBA market, and thus it will promote the game on a global stage.
We can play a productive role in helping the people of the United States and the people of China have a better understanding of each other and see that we're all human beings and that there is commonality between us. And I think that form of engagement is critically important.
Once again, this is how the league is going to try to formulate this relationship. This is going to be the marketing behind it. We're trying to find common ground through sports, and we're all humans at the end of the day. The league at the end of the day is going to have to justify this relationship with China to the US consumer, especially after they sort of had to bow down with the preseason issue that happened when the players went over in China.
If we're going to work together to try to resolve some of our issues, and those issues include dealing with future pandemics and dealing with global climate issues
and also global competition. US and China, best believe, they are in competition with each other, and it's only going to intensify going forward.
Economic issues and human rights issues, that they have to begin from a point of discussions directly with each other. And I think to the extent that, through sports, that, again, as I said, that's something that we can at least find common ground on.
Adam Silver has a hell of a job. People thought the Donald Sterling situation was crazy. He has to deal with the league losing the revenue in 2020. He has to deal with this China situation and at the same time trying to grow the game. Because once again, domestically, the game has not grown in viewership since 2003, since Jordan had left. It's on a steady decline. So globally is where they're going to find their growth. And also at the same time, they're going to tap into that money. And at the same time, they get to compete with the NFL as far as the growth. Because the NFL is getting it domestically, but not globally. So the NBA could be the first to tap into that market and get that growth. Once again, Adam Silver's in that gray area with that China situation that Daryl Morey had caused, because at the same time, they could not denounce the way China handles their issues, but at the same time, they almost had to be careful and not offend the US consumer into kind of shaming Daryl Morey for his freedom of speech. It's a very, very gray area and sticky situation the league is in, because best believe that Chinese relationship is very important for the growth of the league. Now, Adam Silver was also asked about the future of the play-in tournament, as a lot of players, especially Mr. LeBron James, surprisingly had complained about it. Now, the play-in tournament does bring some brand new interest to the game, but at the same time, it kind of makes a 7th seed kind of pointless, because what's the point of finishing 7th if you still have to fight with the 8th seed and perhaps the 9th and 10th seed just to secure your spot? And at the same time, all the metrics and stats of the actual game of the play-in tournament does not count. It's almost like it's an official game, but it's not counted toward the record books or anything. The stats don't even matter.
Sure. So first, on the play-in tournament, it's my expectation that we'll continue it for next season. We both, of course, need agreement from our teams and the Players Association. And I know, Michelle Roberts doesn't have an easy job. She has 450 players. Some maybe have louder voices than others at the table. But again, I think ultimately, although there were critics, not just LeBron, but others who weren't in favor of it, and maybe some teams who weren't thrilled with it, I think overall it was very positive.
And it is very positive, because at the same time, you see how teams are starting to maneuver for the NBA draft. Teams are not caring about it as much. The tanking situation is almost about alleviated. Most teams aren't trying to tank, and it keeps the league competitive. A lot of teams are staying on their toes. They see the possibility of making the playoffs and boosting further revenues, especially after the pandemic. So overall, the play-in does have its positives. Some players may bitch about it, but overall, it's definitely garnering more interest.
For the league and the players, I mean, certainly there's been some suggestions about some tweaks we should consider. But again, I think once we bring it back to our owners for a vote and the Players Association meets and has an opportunity to consider it, it's my expectation that it'll continue for next season.
Now, David Stern was also asked about the NBA thinking about the expansion. We heard a lot about expansion rumors, especially after the 2020 season, was going through its flux. It might have been delayed. It might have been canceled. How was the league going to make revenues back? So things at the time were in flux, but the league was able to get a private loan with one of their partners. I believe it was probably State Farm, one of their ad partners, or even a big company like Disney. Some big institution loaned them money at a low interest rate, and they were able to divvy it out to all the teams as a form of relief. And they're pretty much have to pay off that loan within the next 10 years. It's a really good loan. You can only get that type of loan from accredited companies or just institutions. So they're not really worried about making interest on the money. They're sort of helping the NBA out because they are a partner, and their survival is good for their business. So the NBA got some alleviation through that. They didn't have to worry about expansion, getting a one lump sum payment of cash from the new owners. So Adam Silver was asked about it, and let's see what he had to say.
I think ultimately, although there were critics, not just LeBron, but others who weren't in favor of it, and maybe some teams who weren't thrilled with it, I think overall it was very positive. For the league and the players, I mean, certainly there's been some suggestions about some tweaks we should consider. But again, I think once we bring it back to our owners for a vote and the Players Association meets and has an opportunity to consider it, it's my expectation that it'll continue for next season. In terms of expansion, I know that was reported that, when revenues were down, we were looking more seriously at expansion. I mean, it didn't work exactly like that, largely because expansion's a multi-year process. So it wasn't as if the pandemic came, we're 40% down, we can quickly collect some expansion revenue. So, yes, it's true that we actually had some time while we were initially shut down and we were meeting more often with our teams to think a little bit more about it. But it seemed the consensus was, certainly during a pandemic, that wasn't the right time to.
And also, let me say this, certain cities got major consideration, especially among teams that exist currently right now. They may look to move to either Kansas City or Seattle. They were pretty much the front runners as they had the infrastructure to support an NBA team. They had the airports, enough corporations that already exist in the city, the nightlife, the population. Those cities are going to get major considerations for certain franchises to move there.
Expand, but that we should continue to consider it. I'll say what I think it's lost sometimes is that from an economic standpoint, from the way the league looks at it, is that we're in essence selling equity in the league. You have 30 partners and just say hypothetically expanded by 2 more teams, then you'd have 32 partners. So,
and when you have 32 partners, you're diluting the product. NBA to me is already diluted enough. They kept on expanding, especially after the Orlando Magic came in, and it just pretty much dilutes the product. It's very hard to find enough players at a high enough talent level to keep the product interesting on television. So once you keep expanding the league, it's like you kind of have a bit more lesser talent playing, and overall the product quality kind of comes down. So it's a tricky situation with that. Yeah, you get a cash lump sum payment from the brand new owners, and at the same time you're going to increase your overhead costs.
You have a national television deal or global television rights. Instead of it being divided 30 ways, it's divided 32 ways. So
yeah, exactly, right there. You're increasing your overhead costs. So your TV deal now, instead of getting split among 30 teams, now it's 32, and et cetera, et cetera. So all the revenues you make, you have to split it with more people. That means you're going to get less of the pie. It kind of has a trickle down effect. So it wasn't an instant solution. Like I said before, the main solution NBA found was getting a private loan from one of their TV partners, or just one of their partners in general, that was not interested in making interest off that loan, just sort of getting a nice repayment and keeping the league functioning because their survival is important for their own business.
It's sort of cash up front, depending on what you sell the expansion team for, but it's not necessarily the windfall that I think people think it is. The most important considerations for us when we look at expansion is, will it ultimately grow the pie? Meaning, and it's potentially 30 more jobs if you expand with 2 teams, you expand the league's footprint. How does that help us in varying ways? Sort of increase support nationally. So we'll continue to look at it. I mean, I've said this many times before. I mean, we're certainly not suggesting we're locked at 30 teams. I think at some point it'll make sense to expand, but it's just not at the top of the agenda right now.
And also, the league could expand, but their talent pool has to increase. Like the number of superstars that come into a league, particularly in one draft class, has to change all that. Like for example, in the 96 draft class, AI, Kobe, Steve Nash, they have to have like a few excellent classes come in like that. Then they could think about expanding, because we just have a plethora of superstars and we could actually dilute this product a little bit more and spread it out. But I'll link in the description below the video I made about the private loan the NBA had gotten last year in order to maintain their survival and just help out some of the smaller market teams, especially on some of their costs of not keeping these stadiums full and just operating during the pandemic. Now, next up, Adam Silver was asked about load management, as sometimes it creates a sticky situation because on television, fans tend to check into the games to see their favorite superstars, or even they attend the games and pay high ticket prices to see certain guys, but all of a sudden they're healthy and they're not playing. So Adam Silver was asked about the future of load management and if it actually really works.
We haven't addressed it so specifically for next season, only because I think as we watch what's happening with COVID, we're mindful that as much as I want to sort of close the book and say we've lived through it, of course, I'm reading the same stories you all are, about Delta variants and other things. I mean, again, I'm very hopeful we're going to put it behind us, but that could have an impact on how we schedule rest. I will say, again, this is not something that's been talked a lot about in the context of injuries, but resting is up over 100% this season from last season. And
that's because players are not practicing. There's been barely any practices, or most of these practices have been walkthroughs. But there's really been no time for players to practice. That was a clever trick by Adam Silver right there. The players' rests are up 100%. That's because there's no practices.
And the issue which we're trying to get to the root of is, does resting work, frankly? Does load management work? I mean, and there's different theories out there on it. And what's most surprising, as I said, it's not just about injuries up this season. We've seen this upward trend for several years. And
that's because the specialization of basketball from a lot of these guys from a young age. They're going through all these AAU programs, playing multiple games in a weekend. Sometimes even in a day, they're playing 4 or 5 games. And the shit takes a toll. By the time they make it into the league, these guys are getting major injuries by the age of 23. You sort of see the same thing happening in baseball with all that Tommy John surgeries from these pitchers. It's basically the specialization of sports. Kids from a young age, they're prepping themselves to become professionals.
To believe that with the investment, the level of sophistication, the number of, doctors, like the amount of analytics we look at, that the data we're able to collect that we couldn't in the old days, that we, putting the pandemic aside, would have seen improvements, and we haven't seen that yet. And so, I mean, part of it, of course, load management or resting, there's an economic impact on that. There's no doubt that if you're, and I understand it from a fan standpoint. I mean, they want to see their teams advance, and they're even sympathetic to a certain amount of rest, but they don't necessarily want to pay the same price for the ticket if the stars aren't playing, or whatever television, programming looks like in the future in terms of how people are charged for it,
Exactly, and how much you guys been charging for it. You guys want more and more money every new TV deal. So you better guarantee some of these guys are playing. They better not be healthy just sitting on the bench. But this issue, once again, it's pretty much going to have to start with the AAU and sort of the high school / college system. How much are these guys being worked out, burned out, and how they basically are coming up before they make it into the NBA? Because a lot of players are getting major injuries even before the age of 24. It's very odd. But once again, I believe it's because of the specialization in sports. These kids from a very young age, all year round, are playing multiple games, and sometimes multiple games in one day, not even in a week, in one day. And it's pretty much has caused a bunch of injuries by the time these kids reach into their first 4 to 5 years into the league.
So they might be both rooting for rest, but saying the game doesn't have the same value. And I think we got to find the right sort of midpoint there between, clearly if players hardly played at all, there would be a dramatic reduction, presumably, in the amount of injuries. Although we see a lot of off-season injuries now. We see a lot of injuries during training. And load management isn't just a function of how many minutes in a game a player plays, but how much, what else they're, what other burdens they're putting on their bodies when they're not playing, and how hard they're training and what they're doing in the off season. So nothing could be more important for our league than keeping, especially a league where stars drive so much of the interest of keeping them on the floor longer. So my only thing on load management is sometimes I think people just accept, to me, in a sort of non-scientific way, that load management works. It's just not all that clear. And I think it's another area where historically some of the teams have thought about their medical protocols as kind of their secret sauce. And I think at least there's a recognition now, especially players have shorter contracts. There's more movement of players, that we all have a common interest in players staying healthy, and that we should, in the same way we have in many business areas in the league, be looking at best practices when it comes to rehabilitation and training of our players. So it will remain a focus on the league, but and again, what the optimal number of games are in the season. As I said, we've had this 82 game season for 50 plus years. I mean, is 82 optimal? It's interesting. We got this experiment during the pandemic to move to 72. Everybody thought that was the cure-all, that we just lopped 10 games off the season. I mean, obviously injuries are up, so that...
As they should be up, because there was short rest time between the games. In shorter months, you had to complete the season. And also, players were fresh off of coming off that bubble. So, of course, injuries should have been up.
Now it's just one data point, but this is one that requires a lot more study.
Yeah, just summarize some of Adam Silver's talking points here. It was interesting that he said players have short-term contracts, and it's going to lead to a lot more load management now because the number of years aren't even guaranteed because they're going to be fighting for brand new contracts. And them staying injury-free is going to be very important. So that's an interesting dynamic there. And also, I want to emphasize, remember, high school kids, amateur kids, kids in college now can monetize their likeness. So best believe there's going to be a major incentive for these kids to stay on point and keep training, keep playing more games, and keep focusing on specializing on their talents. So these kids may even come into the NBA by the time they get up to that level. Some of them may come in burned out. So this is going to be ratcheted up to the next level. You're going to have 11, 12-year-olds, 9-year-old phenoms or potential phenoms just being hammered down by the amount of games they have to play every single weekend, different AAU tournaments. So injuries from future stars at a very young age could be very likely. But once again, this really starts from just the youth leagues going on up. That Adam Silver is going to have to make certain adjustments or just make certain observations. How are these kids coming up? Why are they playing 6-7 games between Friday and Sunday or just every weekend? It just doesn't make any sense. And by the time this kid becomes a star and gets into the league, by the time he's 22, 23, he's getting major injuries that normally a 31-year-old would get. These are sort of the dynamics that are kind of playing out. And eventually, Adam Silver, they're probably going to look into this because baseball kind of has the same issue once again with that Tommy John surgery. Pitchers are coming in, having to have these surgeries at a young age. Now, the questions kept coming and coming. And oh boy, Adam Silver was asked about the black head coaching issue. And for the league, this was a major issue, especially around the time analytics was introduced around 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18. Around those years, a lot of black coaches started disappearing from the league, or if a black coach was hired at the time, he would get these lame duck jobs. So Adam Silver was asked about the black head coaching issue. It was sort of grouped in with the women's issue, but mainly we have to focus on the black head coaching issue because black players are the ones that built the league from the ground up to where it is right now. So let's check out what he had to say.
Well, in terms of black coaches, obviously we've seen positive developments there in terms of the number of vacancies that are being...
Definitely. 7 out of the 9 head coaches hired this offseason are of African-American descent. But once again, Adam Silver getting asked the tough questions, boy.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Filled. I will say that not unlike a lot of organizations that are dealing with diversity issues, this is something that requires daily attention. So, again, positive movement in that direction, but we're not going to rest on our laurels there. It's something that, back to the point about data, it's something that's a regular part of our team meetings, of our board of governors meetings now, not just in the coaching ranks, but across the league, and making sure teams are focused on it, and that we're also working collectively to develop pools of future general managers like James Jones, and future great coaches like Monty. It's so that's part of the work that we have to do. In terms of women, it's a little bit frustrating. It's an area where even just looking around the room here, it's like you'd like to see more women represented in the room here today in all aspects of our business. And we've historically made more progress in race,
And the league definitely has made progress, but the only issue with the women's coaching thing is that you have to understand a lot of these players, they're going to end up having issues with the coach regardless. So in this era right now, it's going to look really strange if the NBA gets a woman head coach, and then eventually when they have the falling out, it's going to look bad when it's a bunch of guys just ignoring a female coach, which the same thing happens to the men's coaches. They kind of get ignored, and all of a sudden they get tuned out, and ownership or just even the coach himself starts realizing it's time to go. But that overall is going to be a bad look right now, especially in this climate, if just players are starting to tune a woman coach out, which eventually will happen regardless of sex. But the media will frame it into a women's issue when it's really not.
Rather than ungendered. But I think that's beginning to change. It's slow, it's frustrating, but it's the work that we have to do every day to change awareness and develop pools of candidates as well.
And there you go, Adam Silver, definitely getting asked the hard questions. But at the end of the day, he's done a great job. A lot has come to his plate, especially after the Donald Sterling situation. People thought that was a big deal. But just dealing with the pandemic, Kobe Bryant death, and just the league going through financial issues, losing out revenue for the 2020 season, stoppage, the bubble, making sure it's safe, and just getting through the following season while at the same time satisfying their TV partners, making sure that the NBA is ready to be showcased for the Olympics. It's a lot of things coming down his head, man. And it's a good thing he doesn't have a set of hair, because he would be completely bald right now. But overall, I give Adam Silver an A+ on the job he's done as commissioner of the league so far. It's a hell of a start.